Hey there, ceramic students. Welcome back to the studio. In a previous tutorial, we talked through sort of how to use a scrap piece of cardboard, cut to some specific dimensions, roll out some slabs, and then assemble our slab-built form. We did a six-sided cube, but you can do this for all kinds of sort of complex geometric forms, and we can actually even get curves out of it. But if you missed those other parts, check out the first couple videos in this lesson series, because I'm going to pick up today actually with the sort of beginnings of our relief carving piece. I'll actually talk about how to either find a pattern or generate a pattern, and then how to cut down into the surface of the clay to do a shallow relief sculpture. But before we even get to any of the cutting, let's kind of inspect our cubes a little bit and just make sure that everything is set. Now, you may have been a little bit rushed in class, so maybe you didn't quite get all of your seams sealed up. Now, hopefully, your piece is about at leather hard still, and so we're about at a perfect stage to do some carving. But it's not too late to maybe do some sort of tune-ups on the edges of your seams. If you've got some sort of messy areas, if you have any openings at all, we've got to get those closed up, scored and slipped closed. You can just kind of thumb down any weird corners. One thing that I really like to do is, the canvas boards are nice because they don't, like, while the clay is really wet, it doesn't stick, right? So I can kind of bang this thing into its dimensions on the canvas board when it's really wet. But once it's leather hard, I like to find a really nice, smooth, flat surface. In this case, I have a scrap of like marble countertop. We have the black slate countertops in the studios that work really well for this. Anything that's got like a really nice, smooth finish on it, especially if it's really flat, like the grind on a granite countertop is really, really flat, and so makes for truing up your edges really easy. I'm kind of carefully putting two hands on the piece and giving it a couple taps, and I'll go around all four sides and do the top and bottoms as well. So a couple of taps on that really sort of squared up all of my edges. Now what we're going to start thinking about here is really kind of how am I going to break down this cube structure. You may eventually keep, your end goal here for this piece will be sort of a carved object, but it may still be a six-sided cubed form. I'm going to stick sort of roughly with that form, and I'm only going to work with its facets. But if you want to sort of break down this piece and kind of transform the cube, that's awesome. Eventually, and this is really important, it will need a hole somewhere. This piece has already started to dry and shrink, and I want you to think about this for a moment. There's an air bubble trapped inside, kind of like a balloon, right? And as this piece continues to shrink, there's nowhere for that air to go, and so it all of a sudden becomes pressurized. I actually can kind of feel that as I'm bouncing my cube on the table here. There's a bit of spring back, so that means there's pressure on the inside of this piece. Now when we fire these, that's going to become a really big problem because as we heat this piece up, we'll get past the normal kind of hot temperatures that we think of in the 200, 300, 400 degree range. That's like making a pizza, and we'll start hitting big temperatures like 6, 8, 900 degrees. Eventually we'll sort of pause at 1800 degrees for our bisqueware, but well before there, all of that air that's inside your piece will have blown its way out. If that air that's on the inside of your piece can't escape, essentially exhale slowly, pressure will build and build and build, and it will find its own way out. Generally, that happens along the weakest seam of your piece, so that may just be kind of a underwhelming kind of pop, or if you really built your piece well, one of the real tragic sounds to hear during a firing is just kind of a shrapnel-like explosion inside the kiln, and what that tells me is that somebody left an air bubble inside of their piece and didn't give it a breathing hole. So what I eventually will do, if it doesn't get incorporated into my design somewhere that there's a hole in the inside, I'll just leave a pinprick in my piece, even just the size of a needle, needle tool, that's enough space for the air to breathe out. And honestly, with a piece this size, you probably would even feel it. If you pierced your piece right now, you would hear and maybe even feel the air kind of exhale, almost like a popped balloon, because there's pressure already. The piece has shrunk, and so now there's a positive pressure on the inside of the piece. Very important to kind of consider that. I'm not going to pierce mine just yet. I'll wait until I do one more day worth of carving here, and then I'll pierce it, because actually the pressure on the inside is going to help my piece kind of stay in its form. It's still just a little too wet, and so as I start to press on these sides, right, they may want to collapse. The internal pressure is sort of helpful for me in that sense. What I want you to start thinking about is we're going to put some kind of design on the outside of our form here. I want you to think about this cube as having no bottom. That means all 6 sides will be carved. We're going to use a type of carving called relief carving, shallow relief carving, and maybe the most sort of common example of this. If any of you carry change around in your pocket, take a look at one of those coins, and all of the detailing that's been done on those coins is done using a sculptural method called shallow relief. Shallow relief means, yes, it is a 3-dimensional object, but it's very flat. So the difference between the levels of that relief carving, we're talking, thousandths of an inch, tiny, tiny, tiny changes. Now, we won't be doing quite that delicate of work. We're going to be using the tools in your kit. Likely we'll start off today using your fettling knives and just kind of mark off the piece. And then eventually you may be using a dulled version of your X-Acto blade. That will sort of like help us carve here. You may even find that a sort of slightly sharpened version of one of these wooden carving tools. I like using the chisel tip tools myself. Makes for a really great tool to work with as well. So we're not going to be doing really, really minute relief carving, but if you really want to, as the clay dries down, it'll hold more and more and more detail. Today is our kind of blocking day. We're going to get all 6 sides drawn on, and I'll describe the difference sort of on what I mean between sort of a drawing in the clay and a relief carving in the clay. But I'll just kind of describe to you what my basic concept is here. I'm going to sort of ribbon the outside of my clay here. And I'm just going to have sort of the illusion, right, that this cube has been wrapped in tape or ribbon. And to do that, I'll start with like a larger strip, something about the width of a 1-inch piece of tape or so, and then I may reduce down to the size of one of our popsicle sticks. Now, the nice thing about using a piece of sort of a straight edge piece like this already is that I've got both widths of my mark already in place. So I'll just kind of describe to you how I might lay in my lines at first while the clay is still fairly wet. So I'm going to rotate that down the side of the cube here. And I'm not making a very deep mark into the clay. I'm just sort of carefully and lightly marking that line, scoring that line into the surface. And this line is traveling over all 6 faces of the cube, or at least it's traveling all the way around in 3 dimensions. And I'm being careful to make sure that it lines up on the back side. So here is where these designs will start to get tricky. I'm going to make another band that runs around this cube, except I want them to appear as though they have been overlapped. Think about, for example, a design like maybe a Celtic knot, right? They're these famous designs that are full of interweaving designs. That would be a really wonderful way to imagine this piece. Celtic knots are sort of illusions of ropes or twine or tapes that have been sort of wound in through each other. As I carve this in, I want to imagine that this first ribbon is standing up the highest, and then every other band or every other ribbon that I wind through on this piece is going to be underneath this one. So as I make this line, I'm going to stop and kind of create the illusion, right, that this band travels underneath the other band. Now this is going to exist as an illusion both in the drawing, and eventually it'll exist in the pattern as part of the carving. But today is really just a carving day. It's really just kind of a drawing day, so I'm not going to worry too much about the carving just yet. And just like I did on the opposite side, I am going to make sure that I stop my drawing so that I don't draw on top of my first drawing, making sure that both the drawing, which is what I'm doing now, and eventually the sculpture appears as though it's passing under. So I've got a little bit more drawing here to do, but why don't we talk just for a moment about how this is going to come about? What am I doing in the fact? How am I going to create the illusion that not only does the design itself kind of map on top of each other like that, but then how can I carve it in a shallow relief to give that illusion? So it might be useful at this point just to kind of make a quick drawing to understand how we might understand the surface of the clay and carving down into it versus drawing down into it. Imagine that we're looking at my clay cube in sort of cross section here. So any cut or drawing that sort of pierces down into the clay is going to come down in here. And imagine, right, for example, that I just drag my fettling knife across the surface of the clay. It just sort of puts a ding, a little V-shaped ding into the surface of the clay, right? So that the surface of the clay now has a bit of a wound. Now that drawing is going to look like a line drawn into the clay. It won't really have the kind of qualities of relief. So what if then I want that drawing to have some width? And so in this case, I used the kind of band that I'm working with here, right, to kind of establish a right and a left. And so I make my initial marks into the clay. Here's sort of one blown up version of that drawing, and here's sort of another version of that drawing. And I'm imitating, right, the kind of V-shaped notch of the fettling knife. And then I'm going to end up removing just a little bit of clay from either side of that drawing in the sort of shape of a triangle roughly, so that even though the surface of the clay really hasn't changed, I haven't added anything to that surface, I've sort of created this notch or this illusion. What that looks like here is I'm removing one little slice of clay from either side of that cut. Let me show you in the clay. So a drawing in the clay, right, I'm just going to kind of lay one in here, similar to what I just demonstrated. A drawing in the clay, likely on my piece, is going to have a couple of these bands that move through, and I want them to appear dimensional on the surface, and not just dimensional, but I want there to be sort of stacked layers of them. Well, eventually, these drawings, right, they need to have a bit more character to them, so I may come back through and deepen that cut just a little bit, and I'll deepen it maybe a 1/16 of an inch, or you know, just enough pressure to sort of wound the clay. I'm not even cutting halfway through my slab at all. This is still kind of a pretty light cut. Now this piece of clay I have is probably about a day more dry than the other clay, so I'm going to use my X-Acto knife first, I think, just to kind of demonstrate how I might slice out a slight angle to that clay. And then I'll grab my chisel tool to sort of pull that down as well. So I haven't really removed that much clay from this piece. All I've done is sort of lower one edge. So you can see how I've done some of my initial carving here while the clay is still fairly wet. I have not carved very deeply into the clay surface itself. All I've done is differentiate the difference between a drawn line, which is just a kind of a nick in the clay's surface, and a relief carving, which has sort of lowered the edges. I haven't carved out the entire kind of gap, and I haven't lowered all of this clay here. I've just lowered a little notch right sort of just to the side of that clay. Now today's work is going to be pretty rough. I'll probably do mostly drawings. I might do just a little bit of cutting here to sort of remove clay, because there is a point while the clay is still really nice and wet where instead of cutting I can just even do a little bit of compressing. But this is kind of a good way to maybe get going into this piece, is to kind of work with the wet clay, and eventually this clay will stiffen up to the point where it will be about this sort of hardness of sort of a soft wood, right? And then we'll have to use more of a scraping and cutting approach instead of a compressing approach. Right now the clay still sort of allows me to push on it and sort of spread it out almost like spreading butter on toast. That makes relief carvings in clay a little bit more fun. Also, today, right, the clay's not going to hold much of an edge. It's just going to kind of keep on rolling that edge over and making a bit of a mess of it. So don't fuss too much about your edges. We'll come back and fine-tune your edges as the clay dries. So go ahead, find a good pattern to work with on your clay. You're welcome to work the same kind of ribbon pattern that I'm working on. If you like one of the patterns that I've provided for you guys, you could print it out and just sort of transfer it onto your clay. That works as well. If you want to do a little bit of research and find your own patterns, I think that's great. By the end of the sort of first or second day working on this, we should have the entire cube traced out, all 6 sides, and then probably by day 3 or so we'll begin some of the more deeper aggressive carving. Guys, I look forward to seeing the patterns you choose to work with and helping you kind of get this piece off the ground. I'll catch up with you in the studio.